Good morning, everyone. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us in this online lecture here at Tilburg University. My name is Kenny Meesters. I'm a lecturer in information management here at the university. And, this is, of course, unique circumstances, but we also wanted to continue with our education, and we wanted to reach out, make this lecture public, because today, this lecture, we're talking about online collaboration and remote working. Just as an introduction, this course, this class is part of a bigger course on management and information systems. And in this course, we talk about different developments, how these developments impact organizations and companies, and how that transforms them into a new century, a new way of working. So this course runs for 14 weeks, and today is one of the classes of the course. The course is meant for our bachelor students of business economics, and those students have been following different courses. So this course is not per se about the technology, it's not a deep dive in what is technically possible or on online education. Today we're really talking about what does this shift mean when working physically in the same building to online. And aside from these 5 trends that we discuss in our classes, actually today, of course, there is a sort of second or sixth trend or push, which is this virus outbreak that actually moves us as organizations and society to start exploring these other trends and what they can mean for us. Due to the outbreak and the consequences and the government regulations, we're looking at alternative ways of working. We're looking at how technology can help us transform and deal with these changes. So one of these changes, that's going to be the topic of today's class. It's about enhancing organizational communication and collaboration. And this is a key aspect of societies and organizations these days, because technology allows us to work remotely, allows us to connect even though we're not at the physical same place, or even if we're not working at the same time. So we decided that with that topic on the agenda and the developments that are going on, that today would actually be a good opportunity to show that you can do online teaching, that you can work remotely. Partly because it's the content of the course, but also because we are doing that as a university, as many universities are in the Netherlands, currently transitioning from in-classroom teaching to online education. And that change is pretty apparent. This morning when I walked into the university, this was what I saw. The building deserted, no students. Students are not allowed to come to the university. Most of the staff is not allowed to come to the university. And you will see these empty hallways. I think whether that's a university or a company, you will probably recognize these images even in the streets. And our university is also strongly advising on the screens everywhere for people to take precautions. Of course, I'm at the university, but doing this class online. But I can tell you there is almost nobody else in the room except for IT support, who are sitting about 7 meters away from me. We're using disinfectants, so we're taking every precaution and following every advice that we get, and I recommend you do the same. So that's the developments in the physical world, but if we look at the developments in the online world, we see actually an increase. You might recognize tools like Microsoft Teams or Slack or Work or Zoom. And actually, we see a rapid increase. Over 4 times as much of these tools have been being used in the last days. So there's a tremendous move and use of these tools. It's not only the tools that we're using, because this is from a Dutch website. So my apologies that this article is in Dutch. It's from a website, Tweakers. And one of the features of the website is a price watch. And in this price watch, they can also see how many times people click on certain items. And what you will see in the graph is that there is a rapid increase in the number of times people are searching for and clicking through when they want to buy a webcam. So over the last days, there's been a tremendous increase in people buying webcams docking stations, headsets, and so on. So all of that, these two trends, using the tools and buying the equipment, means that we're getting ready and start moving towards working remotely. If the slides are a bit hard to read or we're switching back and forth, no worries. Later on, we'll post the slides in full so you can follow and you can read along when you watch this video later. But for now, these are some of the trends that are happening. So what are we going to talk about today? What's today's agenda? Well, we have two parts. The first part is this lecture where we talk a little bit more about the theory, about the practical implications, about 3 topics. Why do we need to work, communicate, and collaborate in the first place? How has technology and the internet and the web evolved to make that possible? And finally, what are some of the considerations to making that work? So, in case you get lost, I put the 3 colors in there, gold, green, and blue, the colors of our university. So you will see the same colors in the header, so if you get lost or you're wondering where we are, remember those colors. After this initial lecture, we're going to have a short break, and then we're going to continue with a panel. And in this panel, we've invited 4 different people with expertise, people with experience, to talk about what does it mean for our organization as a university, what does it mean for other organizations, this shift. So we will be joined by our IT services director from the university, one of our academic directors, a student, and an expert on telecommunications. So after the break, we're going to talk a little bit more about these topics and these challenges and what they mean now in a practical basis. Okay, so as I said, let's get started with the first part. Why do we need to change? Why do we actually need to communicate? Why do we collaborate? So organizations, they collaborate for various reasons, but most of all, collaboration and thus communication ensures that we pool together our talents, strengths, and ideas. For example, now I'm teaching this class and I can focus on the content because I'm collaborating with people who have an expertise in audiovisual support and IT support. It also increases learning. When you put different people together, they will learn from each other. You can transfer skills. And of course, there is efficiency because you can specialize, you can support, you can help each other. And humans are social creatures. The fact that we are collaborating, that you have a role to play in a team, enhances your job satisfaction. So that's why these are 4 examples of why collaboration is important. There are many more, but these are some key aspects that especially play a role now that we don't work together, especially if you look at enhanced job satisfaction. So how do we collaborate? Well, traditionally it was fairly easy for small teams and small organizations to meet physically, to work in the same place, and that was usually easy. You set a time, you set a place. Larger companies, international organizations, larger institutes were already working remotely a lot, and they're using different channels for communication and collaboration. However, today that has changed. Now every organization is more connected with other organizations. We're doing outsourcing, we're doing remote collaboration, we're hiring expertise. We have suppliers, we have vendors, we have customers all over the globe. So this globalization, this networked approach, means that we are more and more connected. And our work-life balance has shifted. And in the last days, it has shifted dramatically, which means that we were already slowly moving towards different concepts of working. You could work at home, you could work remotely, you could work in the evening, you could work in the morning, and so on. So the work-life balance and the options you have to choose to work when and where you want were already increasing, and now there has been this tremendous push for it in the last days. So what happens when you work remotely together? It is actually a formation of a virtual team. So virtual teams are made of people that work in different places, work in different times. And they face certain challenges when you communicate. So those challenges, for example, is that you might be awake at different times. If you work around the globe, you might not be in the physical same room. And technologies can help to reduce those barriers and allow teams, virtual teams, to work together. So you can actually say that what are these challenges? Well, one of these challenges is the distance. So as you can see in the slide, you can either work in the same place or you can work in a different place. And another axis that you could perceive would be the time. So you work at the same time or you work at a different time. So that's whether you work synchronous or not. So if you map out these 4 quadrants, we would say, well, you can work synchronous in person, you could work remotely at the same time, you could work at different times but in the same place, or you can work at different times in different places. And there's all kinds of interactions that you could map out. So I'll give you an example. So here on the left side of the screen, you will see a couple of interactions and technologies. And I'll give you a minute to think about where you would place them. So which of these are, for example, real-time, in-person, which of these are remotely real-time, which are not real-time and remotely. Okay, well, since we put it online, you can pause it later if you want more time to think about it. But this is how I would map them. Of course, you can argue for different ways of doing this. But for example, in in-person meeting, we do it at the same place at the same time. But if we use a pinboard, for example, and I leave a message in the pantry for my colleagues to do their dishes, it's at the same place, but at different times. I might put that message up in the morning, and they might read it in the afternoon. So on the remote, there's a lot of options you might recognize. Real-time remote, phone calls. But if you work at different times in different places, you use email, for example, so people will read it somewhere else at a different time than when you send it. And I'll give you one more to challenge, would be, put it at the bottom left, is a lecture. So if I would ask you where in this quadrant you could put a lecture, okay, so it's a bit of a trick question because you could actually place them in all 4. You could have a lecture in person in the classroom, which these days is a bit tricky. You could do a lecture, you could follow it remotely, real time. So for the people who are watching now, welcome. So you're the synchronous remote option. People who watch this later at their own PC are asynchronous remote. And for those of you who are watching this at the university at some later stage, you know, those rare exceptions would be same place, asynchronous. So these are a lot of like communications options, and just we tend to think a lot about communication as in real-time communication, phone calls, messages, and so on. But those are not the only options. A lot of companies, organizations use intranets and employee portals. So they allow people to access information at their convenience in a structured way. So these intranets, employee portals now play a more important role, where before you could walk to a secretary or a support team, or you could ask somebody, you might not now need to rely more on these intranets and these portals. So it is really important that these are being updated and that they give the answers that the people are looking for to reduce unnecessary communication. So a lot of these portals, they will include intranet. You could use Yammer, for example, from Microsoft, or SharePoint, where people could upload documents, could ask questions, could provide updates or links to other systems. And a lot of self-service. So for example, this is a snapshot, albeit a bit of an older version, of the Tilburg University intranet. And what is interesting is that these intranets can be tailored. So for us as a staff member, we will see different options than when a student logs in, because we have different information needs. So that allows us to find the information that we're looking for a lot faster. So that's really asynchronous remote information retrieval and sending. Of course, now, in these days, there's, and I'm sure you all recognize, there's been a rapid increase in the video conferencing, which is synchronous but remotely. And there's different options for that. There is extensive dedicated video conferencing systems that are really installed in a room with a lot of equipment and support. They're usually more expensive. But today, since technology has become cheaper, more accessible, connections have become better, there's also the option to do video conferencing at your desktop, at home, from your phone. So video conferencing is a great solution, and it allows people to talk to each other while being in different locations. But there's also some challenges. I'll talk a bit more about these challenges, because some of you may encounter them. When you do video conferencing, initially you would think that, oh, this is great, we can talk to each other as we would do in real life. However, we know that when people communicate via laptops and digital devices, some dynamics change. So when you organize online calls, it's really important you control the meeting, because you're lacking verbal cues of when people want to interrupt. There's also the moderation and decision making, and usually it's good to separate the two in terms of content and who's controlling the content and who's controlling the flow of the meeting. And another criticism often in working in virtual teams or remotely is that there's a lack of follow-up. You know, the meeting is over, you hang up, there's no chat after the meeting about the next action, so a lack of follow-up is often a problem. There's also technical challenges. There's equipment that has to work. You saw the surge in webcams that are being bought. There is a compatibility that you have to take into account. And there are the users you have to think about. Not everybody in your organization might be as able, tech savvy, have the equipment, have the time and capacity to set up and join remote meetings, or might be familiar with it. And part of that is digital literate and digital divide, and we'll come back to that a little bit later in the lecture. But the communication itself is also really a challenge, because you might have cultural barriers that are less apparent when you're working remotely. People may have different styles of conducting meetings. You are more looking at a screen than a person really in the face, especially if you're not using webcams. You don't have non-verbal communication, so it's hard to pick up on cues when somebody wants to speak up, when somebody tends to disagree but is a bit quieter. And of course there is the attention that people might wander when they're looking at a screen, and there might be distractions around them, especially if you're working at home and have kids these days. So you might remember that video or the conference call from the BBC, the expert on BBC who gave an interview while his kids came crashing into the room. And I'm sure many of you can relate to his experience now. I'll also put a link there to a great YouTube video called A Conference Call in Real Life, where they they replay what it would be if all the mistakes that happen in a conference call would happen in a real meeting. For example, people putting push out of the room, making coffee, not muting, or forgetting to unmute, and so on. So just to give you some tips that I've used in the last days communicating online, and some experience I had working with international humanitarian and government agencies where we do a lot of these calls. First of all, organize. So prepare as you would for a real meeting, perhaps even more. Tend to separate what you want to talk about from moderating the call. So it is good that somebody thinks about what we want to achieve and somebody else is moderating who's speaking and giving the words. So ensure that your meetings have a reason, that you know that everybody who joins the meeting knows what they're going to do. Think about an alternative and a backup. In case the call fails, people can't join, there is a technical hiccup, be ready to have an alternative. The alternative doesn't have to be an alternative technology. The alternative could also be we'll cancel the meeting. But you want to think about what happens if we can't do this call. Is it a bad thing? Can we postpone it? Do we need to do a phone call with everyone? And so on. So thinking about that ahead of time gives you more peace of mind going into the call, and you have a plan for when something goes wrong. And most of all, conference calls are things that you have to practice. As more as you do them, the more you become familiar with it. So, and then for the communication, try to build a rapport. There is, as we do more and more online communication and video conferencing, we tend to lose the connection with people because we have efficient meetings, we're talking about them. Try to find alternative ways. I saw people organize dance parties, drinking coffee virtually, and so on. So try to not only make it about work, because you will lose the personal connection. And remember we talked in the beginning about how important collaboration is for the job satisfaction. And in large calls, you can take some lessons from radio communication. They have specific protocols. And my number one tip would be think about muting and unmuting. So if you're not speaking, mute, unmute. When you want to speak, think before you speak. And use the chat option. It's great for quick comments, numbers, confirmation, links, and so on. Okay, enough about the practical tips. What does that mean that we have all these tools available? Now, that means that people can work anywhere we want. Well, I mean, our options are a bit limited these days, but essentially you could work anywhere around the world, anytime you want. And that has sparked what we call digital nomads, people who don't have a fixed workplace, people who work whenever, wherever they want. And they'll take the laptop and they connect. And you will see, if you Google digital nomads, you will see a lot of people, especially in Starbucks and coffee places, moving around with their equipment. I'll give you one example of myself. I do a lot of work in humanitarian crisis management and information management. So when I go on training or I go on a mission, I also tend to be a digital nomad. So half of my stuff and my equipment is packed with IT equipment, but that allows me to set up a nice office with all facilities I need anywhere I arrive. So essentially, we're all becoming digital nomads now, be it at home or elsewhere. So let's move on to the second part. What is behind these developments? What makes that possible? First of all, the web has changed. I won't play the YouTube clip here, but I'll put the link online with the slides later. But the old days, for people from my generation and older, the internet was a place you went to retrieve information, and if you wanted to put information on the internet, you would really need to learn how to program. You need to learn how computers operate, how to push messages online, and so on. So the web, for most people, was really to retrieve information in the 80s. So the clip here talks about how newspapers made their newspaper available on the internet back then. And you really had a separate department who was coding the messages and making them available. And as a user, you could only go to dial into the newspaper office and retrieve that newspaper. So it was really a passive one. That has changed. Web technologies and developments in information and communication technologies made it possible that we can also contribute. So we call that Web 2.0. It's not only you as a passive consumer, but you can also create content. Think about things you put on social media, on Instagram, on Twitter. That allows you to contribute information. So these technologies make it easier for everyone to contribute information. And that has also changed from the old days where the tech people ruled the internet and at least the content of the internet. Now, content creators are not per se the tech people anymore. They could be creative, could be businesses. So essentially anyone can now contribute. It's not only the techies anymore. It's not only organizations anymore, it's also the individuals. And there's a lot of tools available that allow you to do these things. So even if you're contributing in a Google Doc, it is you submitting information to the internet that you can share with. So I'll give you a minute to think about which tools there are to work online for each of them. And there's probably many more, but here are a few. So for spreadsheets, you can, like for a lot of them, you can use Google or Microsoft Office or Zoho. So there's a plurality of tools to be found online that allow people to contribute. Two more things about these evolving web capabilities. The first one is mashups. So mashups, because we now can contribute information, but technologies also allow us to combine information. So that allows us to make portals and combine information. So one of these examples is the dashboards that you see for the coronavirus. They pull in information from a variety of sources and present it to you as an integrated view. So essentially, the website is doing the same thing as a user could So these developments have allowed websites and computers to also read other websites and pull information in. So I won't go into the technical details about this, but if you're interested, you could look up you could look up APIs, application programming interfaces, extended markup language, XML, JSON, and so on. So these technologies allow also websites to communicate and exchange information with each other. So not only individuals anymore, but also systems. And the second thing that is happening with this Web 2.0 is a network effect. So it means that because we're contributing information, a lot of these platforms are being formed that rely on a large number of users. So if you think about Reddit or social media, they get adopted because there is a critical mass. The same goes perhaps for within your organization. It's great if different tools are being introduced, but at some point, wherever the majority of people is going to, that's where the critical mass is going to be, and that's going to continue. So we call that the network effect. The effect of having a number of people on your platform, which makes it interesting for other people to join. And this is something, especially in these days when there's a lot of improvisation going on, to keep in mind, and where possible, to direct. Because you might have people joining different platforms at this point, people connecting with different tools. So over time, it will emerge or will gravitate to where its most users are. So that is the technology. Let's talk a little bit about the content, because there's two kinds of knowledge that you could share. The first one is explicit knowledge. So explicit knowledge means knowledge that we can write down, that is easily documented. Think about data, think about procedures, software, documents, anything that is easily digitized, for example, or easily relayed, presented, and transformed. The other one is tacit knowledge, and that's a bit harder to grasp because it is subjective. It happens in our minds. These are skills, experiences, insights. These are much harder to capture in a digital system and to transfer. So as we go to these digital systems, we're working more on explicit knowledge and less on this tacit knowledge. I'll show you a bit of an example of the two. When we talk about explicit knowledge and generation and consumption, we call it, it's called combination. The reference to the paper from Polanyi is above. So for those kind of explicit to explicit, you can use automated systems. You can use these mashups that I refer to, intranets. Those are great places. So it's written communication, for example, in emails. It's something that's written down, it's something that's easily read. Tacit knowledge is a bit harder. It usually happens in social interactions, and that's why we call it socialization. It's when people meet face-to-face, when you have communities where people transfer values, transfer insights and knowledge. Something that's hard to capture. I mean, you can record a video like this, but it's still not the same as being in person discussing specific subjects. This is quite passive. But between the two, are interesting things happening. So internalization is explicit knowledge that you start using internally is tacit knowledge. So for example, the things I'm telling here, I'm making them explicit, I'm showing them on slides, I'll share them online later, they're in a video. However, if you want to act on it, you internalize that knowledge and you start applying it to your own situation. So that's online learning or stuff you find on the internet that you start using. Then there's the externalization, is actually something that is tacit and I'm making it more explicit. So it's actually the other side of the lecture. It is where I have knowledge in my mind and I'm trying to put it in slides, I'm trying to make it explicit. So it could be answering questions from somebody. Especially nowadays, you might have in your organization a lot of people who need some feedback. You know, they might ask a question and answering that. So you use your tacit knowledge to answer an explicit question. A great example of where these two really happen is Wikipedia, or any wiki, or intranet, or whatever system, knowledge management systems, we call them, you use. Because that's the place where, first of all, you are making your tacit knowledge explicit, what you know, how do you make sure that other people can read it. So think about manuals, tips, tricks. But you can also look at it as a place where you can find the information that is explicit and start using it for your own situations. So best practices. I'll give you one great example, and I was chatting with them last night. It's a coronavirustechhandbook.com. So it's a set of Google documents that is being crowdsourced, which means people are collaborating on it online. And in these documents, you can find tips, tricks for various situations on how to work remotely and how to work online. So one of the handbooks they're working on is a handbook for online education. So people are contributing knowledge that they have, their tacit knowledge, making it explicit using these Web 2.0 technologies, and other people can access it and start using it, start accessing this explicit knowledge and start using it. So that transformation from tacit to explicit and back to tacit is becoming more and more important these days, because before tacit knowledge to tacit knowledge is something that happens more in social interactions. So this Coronavirus Tech Handbook is a great resource, and you can contribute to it with your ideas, and you can learn from others. So this is the current status of the internet and the technologies, but there are more developments going on. So there is the developments of the semantic web, which means that computers and systems will be even better in understanding what exactly is that each website, application, system holds, and be able to understand the context of it. So computers could understand what is there, and machines could talk to machines and learn from each other. So it allows you to better find the information. And then the Web 3.0 is actually a development that's going on already, where you center it around accessing information in a way that suits you. So at the location with the relevant information in a manner that's easily accessible. That doesn't have to be your phone, that doesn't have to be a browser. It could be, in devices that alert you or something. It could be in other Internet of Things applications. So it will be less visible, more integrated into devices, and more integrated into our daily life. So there are a few examples of that already, but I won't go into the technical details yet. Just saying that there's more developments coming that, further make the distinction between our physical, going online, retrieving information, and our tasks will become smaller and smaller. That gap, they will become more integrated, and that gap will become less visible, tangible, feelable. Okay, so in the last part of this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about the management of these remote collaborations and give some considerations. And now, be careful, they're not exhaustive, they're not complete by any means, but these are some of the common elements that you will find when implementing systems. And we're going to talk after the break, we're going to talk a bit more about these challenges. So first of all, it's good to clarify again that when we talk about information systems, especially in our courses in information management systems, we're not talking only about IT and information technology. That's definitely one part where you have the data, you have the information, stored the knowledge that you want to transfer, so let's say the content of the system, and the technology you use to transfer it, so hardware, software, networks, and infrastructure. But an information system also exists of other components. The organization that you use it, whether that's a formal organization, a company, an institute, or your community, your neighborhood organization, volunteer, civic organization, doesn't matter. But within that organization, within that group, within that team, you will have policies, you will have a shared value culture, you will have processes that you will follow. And then perhaps the biggest component is the people. They're the ones who are using it, but also supporting it, maintaining it, and so on. So when you implement a solution, you say, we want to work remotely, we want to implement virtual teams, or we're going to move to an enterprise resource planning system, or whatever. Don't always focus on the technology. Also consider what it means for your organization, what it means for your people, and how you can connect, align these four elements in order to have a successful adoption. So let's take a look at those four components a bit in relation to remote working and online collaboration. First of all, I already talked a bit about this data and the information and the knowledge, the content that we're being shared. I already mentioned this tacit explicit. So that's an extra effort that we have to make when we work remotely. We have to start typing. We have to start producing videos. So there's an extra step in transferring our tacit knowledge to somebody else when we're working remotely. So we have to think about how do we capture this knowledge. So I'm lucky at the university where I have these options and these people that can facilitate and help me make that knowledge explicit. But for organizations, depending on what you're trying to do, that might be different. So also think about how to allow for updates. You know, lectures might be valid for a couple of years even, but other information changes quickly. So it is fine you make something explicit, you type it, but how do you make sure that people know what the latest relevant information is? There's chat options, you can use intranet portals, you can use updates and so on. But especially when you put things online, it's important that people know which piece of information is the latest and how can we update it in case there is something that we need to change. Then there is now, with this push, you have to think about who has access to the data, to our information, to our knowledge. How, not only in terms of security, but also in terms of accessibility. How do we make sure that people can find what they're looking for in an easy manner? There might be more and more information now being put online than ever before. So you have to think about where would people access it from, when, how, and how can we align what we design with that so that the threshold of reaching out, collecting that information becomes lower. So and of course think about the considerations for privacy, safety, and security, but we'll talk in more and extensive detail in one of our later lectures about that. But especially those concerns when you're using public systems is something you have to be wary of. Okay, let's talk about the technology side of that. And for all of these 4 points, we're going to talk more about this after the break in the panel. But this is a graph of the Amsterdam Internet Exchange, which is a major internet connection point for the Netherlands. And you can see that since the outbreak started and as measures being produced, that the throughput in terabytes per second is increasing. So our network infrastructure is being put to the test. More people are working online. Video is pretty heavy in bandwidth use. So you can follow the graph. I'll put the link there as well from the Amsterdam Internet Exchange. And I'm sure every country has something like that. You can see the increase in traffic and our networks that are being used. And so that will be a challenge as well to keep your infrastructure in line with this growth. And every organization is now working to see how they can provide the facilities. There have been outages. I've heard some companies are even doing stress testing at the moment just to see what the capabilities are so they can take appropriate measures. Coming back a little bit to the privacy, safety, and security that I talked about data, the same applies to the technology. First of all, you might now see options like Google is offering free software, other companies have reduced prices, so there's a lot of options that suddenly have become interesting. A lot of people are using them. But as I said, you have the network effect. As soon as more and more people start joining you on the platform, the more interesting it becomes for others to join as well. And all of a sudden, everybody's on the platform and you can't move away anymore. As an organization, as we move through the crisis and you start, want to consolidate the systems, you might experience what we call a vendor lock. So once you start using the systems, it becomes easy to use associated systems from them. You adapt the ecosystem, and it limits your choices in the future to adapt. I'm not saying that it's per se a bad thing to go to use external vendors and outsourcing. Just a mindful consideration in rapidly doing something, because it's very hard to move away from a system once people are in it. Then the second part is dependency and control. You will see here was an outage of Microsoft Teams in northwestern Europe last Monday for 2 hours. Cloud and solutions, which these drive, are great. They allow for a much larger scale than any individual organization could be. But you do have limited control options to intervene. You're sort of dependent on the capabilities of others. Again, not saying that that's a bad thing, it's just a consideration. And again, what I said during the video conference call, think about what your options are for backups and fallbacks. And then there is, of course, privacy. A lot of these companies nowadays, if you use free software, a lot of that software, you might already know, you pay with your data. For example, I personally also used Zoom a lot, but if it's worth checking these systems and Googling them before you fully commit to them. You should also remember that your employees, or students in our case, don't have a choice. If we as a teacher say we're going to use Zoom, there's limited things that they can do. So you're sort of forcing other people to adopt the systems that you're doing. So again, not a bad thing per se, but a careful consideration for all these elements is in order. So then for organizations, remember in the beginning we talked about why do we collaborate, and now as we're collaborating more and more online, we have to start making different agreements. So our decision-making processes change. How do you make decisions online? Not everybody might be comfortable in speaking up in an online meeting. So how do you make sure that people, are committed, are supporting you really? That absence of nonverbal cues also changes how we make decisions, and I think that's a key consideration. Think about meetings, protocols. Do we have to have meetings? How do we communicate? And your standing procedures. So for us as a university, there's a lot of things that we have in our documents and in our internal regulations that require, that have always assumed that people would meet in person. And we have to start revising those procedures. So it might be worth checking, even if you're not thinking about it now, or might not have encountered them, what does that mean? Are all our procedures still valid? Are they working? Do we need to adapt them? And then for the engagement, so what you could see, and perhaps you could even encourage it, is that aside from meetings, you could also have digital communities. I know organizations are using things like Slack, Mattermost, Microsoft Teams to also have these informal communication going on. I saw on Twitter last week that people did an online dance party. So they made a group video call, put on music, and started dancing together. So it is something that is also important that, if you want to keep the social cohesion, it should not only be about work. Your organization is more than the procedures. So talk to your HR people, think about how to keep people connected. And make sure everybody's in, and I'll come back to that in a minute as well. Because for some jobs, for us as teachers, it might be relatively easy to do some of our teaching online. But for other jobs, think for example IT support, facility services, they don't have an option, or their job doesn't lend very well for working remotely online, which creates a disparity in your organization. So think about how do you include everyone in the system. And then the last component I want to talk about is this fit between the people and the technology. So how do you stay in touch? And it is important that you evaluate regularly. Keep monitoring it. Don't assume that you put an application or a system in place and things are solved. This is from, I saw in Wuhan, where teachers were using an app to send kids homework. And the kids realized that this app is in the Apple Store, so they all start giving it negative reviews. So much that it was in 1 star and got removed from the store. By the way, I'm not encouraging my students to start downvoting any applications we're using, but I'm recommending organizations to keep an eye on what your users are doing, what people are perceiving. So also evaluate regularly if it's still working. Reach out, because people might not tell you directly. And think about support, because it's great that you have a lot of support, that you have these systems, but before I could take my laptop to the IT service desk, now I need my laptop to contact the service desk. So, providing support for remote support remotely is a bit of a paradox that you also have to think about, and it might require a different way of providing that support through phone numbers, additional assistance, and so on. The last point I want to conclude this section with is that this what we call the digital divide. For some of us, it might feel very comfortable to work remotely, to work online. You have the skills, you have the equipment at home, maybe have the peace of mind at home, but not everybody has that. People might not have the opportunity, they might not have the time. Some people find it difficult, they're not trained for it. So that is what we call the digital divide. And the risk is that this digital divide now will become bigger than ever. Because people who are digitally literate will have access to more information, are able to communicate faster and quicker, and it will make the gap bigger. So people with time, resources, will benefit from it. And I would personally recommend to also think about the older people who are affected by the coronavirus. For many of us, it is easy to go online, to go on social media, to connect, to keep these interactions going. Not everybody has that option. So please don't forget to pick up your phone and also call people. Find alternative ways. Don't stay only in the internet bubble. Find other ways to especially reach those who are not there. It's easy to focus on the people who are online. Do not forget the people who are offline. Okay, so that's the 4 components I wanted to talk about in this last part. The data and the information we're transferring, the technology we use, the organization, and the people in the system. So I want to wrap up this part by first of all thanking our IT staff, and I recommend you do the same in your organization. So we've been, a lot of these people have been working day and night to make sure that the systems scale up, that people who are working in the organizations have the support they need, and they're often invisible, as you can see now, they're an invisible group of people behind the scenes. So I personally want to thank everybody here at the university for their support, and I recommend that everybody also does that for their organization.